A routine traffic stop takes a shocking turn when a police officer drags an elderly black man from his car in what seems like an all-too-familiar story. Tension fills the air as the officer demands answers, assuming the worst about the man behind the wheel. But just 3 minutes later, the situation flips in a way no one saw coming. The man, calm but firm, reveals his true identity, and the officer realizes he's face to face with the city's newly appointed judge. What follows is a powerful lesson about perception, assumptions, and justice. This story isn't just about one dramatic moment, it's about what we can learn from how we treat one another, no matter the situation. Stick around as we dive into this incredible encounter and uncover the truth behind it. The scene had unfolded on a quiet street where the officer, a seasoned cop with years on the force, had pulled over the aging grandfather for what seemed to be a minor traffic violation. The man behind the wheel, dressed in a crisp suit, sat patiently as the officer approached, but things escalated quickly. The officer's tone was harsh, his demeanor stern, as he ordered the man to step out of the car. Onlookers began to gather, whispering nervously, unsure of what they were witnessing. The grandfather complied without resistance, though his steady gaze never wavered. There was something about him, his calm confidence, that felt out of place in the chaotic moment. As the officer grew more impatient, the man finally spoke, his voice steady but commanding. "You might want to rethink how you're handling this," he said simply. But what did he mean? The officer tightened his grip on the man's arm, frustration bubbling to the surface. A bystander began recording the scene on their phone. The crowd grew, murmurs of concern and confusion filling the air. "He doesn't seem like a threat," someone whispered. But the officer wasn't listening. He was focused on asserting control, unaware that this encounter would soon become the talk of the city. The man remained composed, his voice calm despite the tension. "Officer," he said, "I suggest you check my identification again." His words were deliberate, almost like a warning, but the officer ignored him. Instead, he continued to demand answers, growing more agitated by the moment. Meanwhile, the crowd's unease deepened. Was this just another case of someone being unfairly targeted? Or was there something deeper happening here? The officer, still unaware of the weight of his actions, was about to have his world turn. The officer, now visibly annoyed, called for backup, determined to assert his authority over the situation. The man's calm demeanor only seemed to frustrate him more. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rising with impatience. The man adjusted his suit jacket, glancing briefly at the growing crowd. His calm presence stood in stark contrast to the officer's mounting tension. "You'll find out soon enough," the man replied evenly, almost as if he wasn't the least bit concerned about the situation. Backup arrived, 2 additional officers stepping out of their squad cars and assessing the scene. The first officer quickly explained his version of events, painting the man as uncooperative. But as they approached the grandfather, one of the newly arrived officers hesitated. His eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Wait, is that?" he began, but before the officer who recognized the man froze, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. He stepped closer, his voice low but urgent as he addressed his colleague. "I think you need to check his ID now," he said, but the first officer brushed him off, unwilling to admit he might have made a mistake. The man stood quietly, watching the tension unfold. The crowd grew restless, sensing something big was about to happen. Meanwhile, the officer who called for backup glanced down at the wallet he confiscated earlier, finally pulling out the man's identification. His eyes skimmed over the card, and suddenly, the color drained from his face. The silence was deafening as he looked back at the man, realizing the gravity of the situation. "Sir," he stammered, his tone completely different now. But before he could apologize, the man took a step closer and said, "Do you finally understand who you are dealing with?" Could finish, the man turned to face him directly. Upside down, about to find out. The officer stood frozen, staring at the ID in his hand, as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. He glanced at the man in front of him, his confidence crumbling. The bystanders were still recording, their whispers growing louder, but the officer could barely process what was happening. Slowly, he handed the ID back to the man, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth sank in. The man they'd just witnessed being dragged from his car was the city's newly appointed judge, set to oversee cases in the very courthouse this officer worked with. The man took his ID, tucking it back into his wallet without a word. But before turning to leave, he paused, locking eyes with the officer. "I hope this is a moment you'll never forget," he said, his voice steady but laced with quiet authority. Then, as he walked back to his car, he added, almost as an afterthought, "I'll be seeing you in court soon." The officer stood rooted in place, his face a mix of embarrassment and dread. Little did he know, this wasn't just a lesson in humility, it was the beginning of a reckoning. As the man drove away, the officer remained motionless, grappling with the weight of what had just occurred. The crowd began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with disbelief and the powerful lesson they had just witnessed. Videos of the incident were already circulating online, sparking conversations about respect, prejudice, and accountability. In the days that followed, the officer was called to the courthouse, not to issue a citation, but to stand before the very judge he had wrongfully mistreated. The man, now seated on the bench, looked down at the officer with the same calm expression he'd worn that day. But instead of anger, his words were measured and thoughtful, addressing the importance of fairness, humanity, and learning from mistakes. The encounter became a moment of reflection for the entire community, a reminder of how quickly assumptions can lead to conflict, and how understanding can pave the way for change.